Welcome everyone to today's sessions. I'm glad to see everyone. I hope for folks who attended the keynote speaker session today that you enjoyed it and you learned a lot. Professor Benjamin was absolutely fantastic. And I am excited to start today's hands-on workshop. So we welcome today Dr. Michael Strawser. In just a few reminders for folks that need captions, you can activate them at the bottom of the screen. There is automatic captions. You can also use the Q&A box also at the very bottom of the screen to ask Michael any questions you would like him to address towards the end of the session. In today's sessions, you will learn how to establish effective communication in your classroom and also ensure clarity, good rapport, and active engagement with your students. These are the soft skills of teaching, and there's a lot of good information in the session. So I hope you enjoy. Feel free to use the chat to share your ideas. As much as you give in, as much as you will get in the session. So I encourage you to be active participants. Michael, welcome.
Thanks so much, Lale. So I'm going to go ahead, everybody, and we will get started. So as Lale mentioned, so my name is Michael Strawser. I'm an associate professor of communication at the University of Central Florida. And I really think, Lale mentioned soft skills. And the reality is that part of why I'm passionate about this particular topic is, in part, my guess is over the next few days, you are going to be bombarded with a lot of AI related thoughts related to teaching. And to be honest with you, I just want to spend the next 40, 45 minutes reminding you to be human and reminding you that you are still communicators and that your students still desire that from you. So if you want to connect with me, by all means, I would love that. And I would love to kind of chat with you after the session today. So I would encourage you to do that. So this, I've bombarded you with QR codes throughout the slide deck. So the beauty of the Course Hero Education Summit for most sessions is that you will have access to the slides. This session is no different. So if you miss something, if you miss a QR code, don't worry about it. Just put it out of your mind and you can go back later and access that. But if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, by all means, please do so. Now, a couple really quick things. I give you a couple different resources over the course of this particular session. And I do it just because I think that we all need help as we're trying to figure out how to make our courses a little bit more engaging and really think strategically about how we engage our classes. So this is the first resource I want to tell you about. So I created this a long time ago for my department and some other faculty members that I work with, direct colleagues. And it kind of got a little bit larger, a little bit larger. And so this is what I call a teaching wiki that just has a lot of different topics and some subtopics, some different articles that may be helpful. If you want to use that, that's awesome. But then throughout the session today, I'm going to give you a couple other different resources that I think will be helpful also. All right, so I've got my chat up. As Lale mentioned, I think you will get out of this session what you put in. And so I've got a lot of different questions that I would love for you to answer in the chat for me. So this is the first one. So these 9 questions come directly from student perception of instructor evaluations at the University of Central Florida. So I'm giving you the evaluation questions that my students answer all the time at the end of their semesters once they finish a class with any of their instructors at UCF. My guess is these particular questions look relatively similar compared to what you experience at your own institutions. Now, in the chat, I want you to tell me what you notice, and it could be anything. Like, I'm not giving you a leading question here. What do you notice about these particular evaluation questions? So a lot of effectiveness. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. A lot of effectiveness. It's pretty potent, right? So what do you notice about these particular evaluation questions? Christina, you stole my thunder. Effectiveness used, not specific and measurable. Okay, that's good. Teacher focused. What else? Anything else that you notice? Have a couple more, and then I'm going to show you some different things that I think are relevant and important based on these. So I think that really you've indicated a lot of particular themes here, right? So progressive verbs, student outcomes. Y'all, here's the deal. These are communication questions at their core, okay? And this is part of what pains me about most evaluation questions is that usually we are not really asking whether or not the students have learned anything. Like, these are instructor focused, but also, as Christina mentioned, and this is awesome, these are communication questions. Now, I'm not giving you is this bad or is this good? To be honest with you, I can do another 45-minute session on why this is bad. But I'm just giving you the reality in which most of us live. And the reality in which most of us live is that the evaluation questions that our students answer at the end of a semester, at the end of a course, usually have nothing to do with whether or not they've learned, or at most, maybe they're asked about, their perception of how much they've learned. But really, what we are asking students when they are asked to evaluate our classes is whether or not they liked the instructor, and to be honest with you, whether or not the instructor was an effective, quote unquote, as you can see that particular word repeated here, was an effective communicator. So these are, in essence, communication questions. Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper, right? So I agree with Christina. I think these are communication questions. I agree with, Kevin said they can be emotional based on experience. I totally agree with that too. Richard says they're not really about the learning. Totally agree with that. Let's go a little bit deeper. What key communication themes do you see kind of represented in these particular questions? So yes, I think all of them to a certain extent, except for probably number 9, which measures the quote unquote overall effectiveness of the instructor. I think all of these are communication questions, but what key communication themes do you see represented in these particular questions? So I have a couple of you, giving feedback. That's perfect. What other key themes do you see kind of throughout there? Questions can be bad as well as time, method of getting evals, opinion-based. Yep. How do we make the student feel? Absolutely. Any others? I think these are all, I think this is all accurate. Measuring effectiveness is subjective. I agree with that. Sharing information, opportunities for open communication. All right, these are perfect. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. Now, as I look at these particular questions, I see 3 communication themes that I think are represented. The first is clarity, right? So really what a lot of our evaluations are asking is, was the instructor clear, right? Secondly, I think that we're asking whether or not the instructor established or developed rapport with their students. And then finally, engagement. And we're going to talk about that one more specifically. So let's flesh this out a little bit, right? So I wanted to really kind of give you a little bit of a baseline here. So I'm using the own evaluations that I use, and I recognize that not all of these are representative across institutions, but I at least wanted to give you a little bit of a framework because most of our evaluations look like this. But as I think of clarity-based questions or clarity-based themes, here are the 4 that I see. Effectiveness organizing the course, effectiveness explaining course requirements, the grading criteria, the expectations, effectiveness literally communicating ideas or information, and then number 7 there, giving useful feedback on course performance. All of those to me connect in some way to clarity, right? Let's keep going. These 2, I think, connect in some capacity to rapport. So when I say rapport, what I mean is we're basically establishing a positive relationship with our students. So effectiveness showing respect, it's a key word, and concern for students. And then effectiveness creating an environment that helps students learn. And then finally, engagement. So effectiveness stimulating interest and then helping students achieve course objectives. Now, number 8 is key, right? For kind of the direction that I'm going to go. But here's the reality. And I think as we think about, effective communication in our classes, as we think about what does it mean to be a human instructor in the midst of all of these artificial realities that we're experiencing, I think the core here is still, as we think about our classes, what do we want our students to know, to do, or be able to think, right? So how we incorporate communication effectively in our courses should always tie back to those 3 realities. What do we want our students to know? How do we want their content knowledge to be increased? How do we want them to think about the content? We want to develop positive affect for the course content. Or maybe it's a course that emphasizes behavior, skill driven. But the reality is that we always want our students to be, or our class content to be kind of propping up these different realities of learning objectives and outcomes. So my first key indicator here, and then throughout the session, we're going to go through those key themes. So clarity, rapport, and engagement. But I wanted to give a baseline foundation here to say, look, here's the deal. As we talk about human skills, as we talk about soft skills of the instructor, the reality is that my students will not know where I'm going if I do not know where I'm going. And so my advice at the very beginning of this, right, is to think about our course objectives, to think about practically what are we trying to do with that class, because then in my mind, it doesn't necessarily change our communication, but it provides an additional framework for our communication skills. Now, I told you I was going to bombard you with QR codes and I was going to bombard you with resources. If you would like to visit them, I've done really quick, like webinar style videos, one on creating instructional objectives, because I'm a big proponent of that. I think that, to be honest with you, clear teaching that connects to the learning objectives and the instructional objectives, honestly cures a lot of instructional ills. And so I'm an advocate, right, for thinking strategically about how are we creating effective instructional objectives. So if you want to visit that webinar, you can. I also, and I don't dig into this too much in today's session, but I'm a calm person. I believe firmly in oral communication. Like, I believe in the spoken word. And I think that in some ways, lecture has kind of died this death and taken a lot of arrows, slings and arrows for a lot of ineffective teaching. And I'm still a proponent of lecture, but I'm a proponent of interactive lecture. And I think, to be honest with you, in many ways, that's part of how we can kind of regain our footing as communicators in the classroom, is to think about ourselves as effective and interactive lecturers. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper into that, it's another resource for you that if you want to check out after the session today, by all means. All right, so I want to give you an opportunity here in just a second to kind of think about these two different kind of umbrellas, right? So learner-centered teaching, and then we're going to take that a little bit deeper and talk a little bit about learner-centered communication. So this one probably will be easy. I'm sure we'll get a lot of responses on this one. But when I say learner-centered teaching, what comes to mind? So what is learner-centered teaching? Go ahead and put some of those answers in the chat, and then we'll talk about those here in just a second. So learner-centered teaching as opposed to instructor. Okay, social emotional considerations. That's perfect. Thank you, Jess. So what makes teaching universal design? Yep, UDL. It's great. Reaching all learning styles or learning preferences. That's perfect. Engages students in the learning, right? They're not passive. Student focused. That's awesome. Meeting students where they are. I love that. Students discovering. I love that too. Teachers become facilitators. Authentic, experiential. It's great. Okay, now they're coming in. All right, here we go. Like an avalanche. What do they need to learn to advance? Student generated. Yeah, I love that. We see a lot of instructors nowadays kind of incorporating more agency for students, and I think that's good. Like, I think that helps them become learners for life. Focus on students, not your agenda. That's perfect, Richard. All right, so now I'm gonna kind of take it a little bit. Alternative grading is a good one too. I'm gonna take it a little bit of a different direction. When I say learner-centered communication, what comes to mind? Might be some similar themes that you just thought of with learner-centered instruction, but what is learner-centered communication? Student-friendly vocabulary, perfect. That's a great one. Listening, communication that the student understands. Yes, the focus will be on the students. Coaching, I love that word. That's great. Asking for feedback, letting them speak in their vernacular, no code switching. Clarity, examples that are relatable. Transparent assignments. Yeah, I love that. Meeting them where they are to get them to know where they're going. Clear objectives, reflections. Awesome. This is perfect. All right. So you're starting to think about this, right? Have material available for them on the LMS, communicating in ways that are accessible. That's perfect. That word accessible, I think, is key. So the gears are starting to turn a little bit. The reality is, part of what I want to accomplish with this session is just getting you to step back a little bit and think about your own communication in the classroom. Is it learner-centered? Is your communication learner, not instructor-centered? Now, when we talk about classroom communication, usually, and this is the meta, right? So here's what's happening. Pretty simple. Verbal and nonverbal transactions. I don't love that word, but this is a textbook definition, between teachers and students and between or among students. So doesn't necessarily mean that all of our communication is verbal, doesn't mean that all of our communication is nonverbal, but there are these transactional elements where there's hopefully a feedback loop, there's hopefully, somebody responding. There are different layers of this that are happening, but when we say classroom communication, that's practically what's going on, right? Now, I want you to kind of think a little bit about a couple different realities here. And I want to just kind of give you some philosophical ideas here of why humans, like, why do we communicate? And I think this is really important to think about in the midst of all of these different tech realities that we have, all of these different open AI realities that we have. Why do we still communicate? I think there are a lot of different reasons: affection, inclusion, control, pleasure, relaxation, escape. Those are all different reasons why we still communicate and still desire communication and relationship, right? Arlene says, understanding, that's perfect too. Why do students communicate with us, the instructor? There's a lot of different realities here that I think are important to consider before we dive into clarity, rapport, and engagement. Why do students communicate with us? Maybe it's relational. Most of the time, honestly, it's functional. They might communicate with us to make excuses. They might communicate with us to participate, or even to make a good impression, right? Like there are still power dynamics that exist within our classrooms. Maybe they want to be seen or known in a positive light. The reality is that we never know. And this is part of what, as you think about student-centered instruction and student-centered communication, the reality is that each student is a little bit different, and each situation, I think this is key, is a little bit different. So it doesn't necessarily look the same, right? And even Jess mentions it varies by age. Absolutely. So you might have your traditional students that might communicate with you for different reasons than your non-traditional students. It just depends. So part of what we have to do as instructors is step back and get back to that key human element of being observant in these social situations. That's part of being emotionally intelligent instructors, is going, what's really going on here, right? Like, what's really happening? Why is the student communicating with me in this way? What do they need? And it really is kind of a personal needs assessment to a certain extent. Now, I love this. Why do students not communicate with us? So what's holding them back? What are barriers that exist when a student should be communicating with us and they may not be? Right now, that first layer I think is really important: communication apprehension. I live in this world all the time. Communication apprehension is real. It does not necessarily just get limited to public speaking. Like, a lot of people can have communication apprehension about one-on-one conversations. A lot of people can have communication apprehension about writing, some sort, even an email, right? Communication apprehension, the anxiety that we feel related to communication in any endeavor, is real, it is prevalent, and it is felt by a majority of people. But that's one particular reason why students may not communicate with us. Lack of affect or motivation, they just don't want to. They just might be apathetic towards us, towards the content, towards life at that particular moment. That's real too. Avoidance of a teacher's pet identity. This is still real, right? So a lot of students might communicate with us to make a good impression. There might be some students that go the complete opposite direction. They don't want to communicate with us because they're afraid of how that will be perceived by their classmates in terms of looking like they're trying to suck up, right? Lack of instructor sensitivity. This is huge. So they might feel like if they share something with the instructor, might even be fear. They don't want to be embarrassed saying the wrong answer. Well, the reality is that what happens if the instructor shows a lack of sensitivity to one of those misbehaviors? Well, that will stop them in the future from trying to communicate with us effectively. Lack of feedback. They might communicate something and the instructor just is neutral and just goes, okay, and that's it. They might send an email and, not get a response back. You never know, right? Could be time, could be environment and setup. It's a lot of different reasons. But again, as we think about communication in our classrooms, step back. What's the observational factor here that exists, right? Okay, so now we're going to spend the majority of our time looking at these key themes that were represented through those evaluations. And I want to start with clarity and give you a couple different things. So hopefully I've set the stage for, look, here's the deal. Communication exists. There are different reasons why our communication, or why our students communicate with us. There are different reasons why they don't communicate with us. The reality, though, is that a lot of times, it just kind of depends, again, on the situation. Some of those can be directly overcome by the instructor. Some of them cannot. But the reality is that you are still the instructor. You are still the facilitator of your classroom. So what does it look like to establish a positive climate where we want to strive for thinking about how we can be, creating positive inroads for communication? So let's start with clarity. I think this is key. And I want to just give you a couple different tips for each of these as you think about hopefully maybe some different things we can all kind of, round out our rough edges in terms of how we're being clear in the classroom. So the reality is that a lot of clarity issues happen because we are not clear in terms of verbal clarity. So what I mean by that is that you are very literally setting up barriers with the words that you say, the tones that you use, that distract students from your key overarching message. So what do we need to do with that? Increase our fluency, and then make sure, and I want to go back to a couple different comments that I saw earlier related to relevancy. If you are using the same examples and explanations in your classrooms that you were 20 years ago, they might not resonate with your students of today, right? So I'll give you a good example. This is not an example that I use in my classes of like if I'm trying to tie something to course content, but when I used to take attendance in a classroom and I had a student, not there, I would make a joke from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Bueller. And my students, 10 years ago, 15. Yeah, thank you, Christine. I'm glad you get it. My students from 10, 15 years ago would still somewhat, think it was funny. I might get one chuckle. Now the students go, who is Bueller? And they're looking around for Bueller, trying to figure out, like, is Bueller in the class? Y'all, we need to be careful and think about how we kind of make ourselves relevant and current in terms of the explanations and examples that we use. So when I say fluency, and then we're going to look at examples and explanations too. The reality is that, and I'm going to steal my own thunder here in just a second, but teaching in a classroom is public speaking. And so you want to be fluent in terms of how you are delivering this oral message, which means we want to avoid stammering when we can. We want to avoid vocal pauses when we can. Okay, right. That's my big one. Right. I do that all the time. False starts. We want to be comfortable with silence. Okay, this is great. Irina says, not native to the United States. I don't know who or what Bueller is. Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's a fine movie. Good way to spend an hour and a half. My students don't know who Ferris Bueller is either. So that they struggle to see those, social references from the 1980s. But when we are fluent with our message, again, we are removing those distractors from students that will potentially serve as barriers to their listening. So we want to increase that fluency and really think about delivery of the message in terms of removing those different barriers. Now, explanations and examples. So as we think about verbal clarity, what do we want to try to do? Remember the experiences of our students, existing knowledge, and points of view. And this is where I struggle because I've been doing this for 15 years. And 15 years ago, the things that I could rely on are not the things that I can rely on today. I'll even use another practical example. The humor that I used in my classes 15 years ago is not the humor that I can rely on today. So I used to be a little bit more sarcastic than I am now. You know why? Because it didn't necessarily land like it does today. And it's not, I was never inappropriate, was never mean spirited, but just a little bit rougher, right? And my students would kind of look at that 15 years ago and go, okay, that's, he can pull it off. Y'all, I can't pull it off today. I just have recognized that. And it's for a variety of different reasons. But that changes how I teach, right? That changes what I'm trying to accomplish in my classes. So remember the experiences of our students. Remember their, where they are in terms of their current situation. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be pop culture. It's just where are they in terms of where they quote unquote live in this particular time. And that's your traditional students and your non-traditional students. So every semester, just do a little bit of a deep dive. What does it look like to be a student right now in your class in terms of where they live, where they exist, what's important to them? Also recognizing their existing knowledge and points of view. These are all things that I think will help in terms of verbal clarity for trying to increase fluency, and then also making sure that we want to establish explanations and examples that are relevant. I think that's helpful. Now, verbal clarity is one thing, but we also want to provide in all of our classroom communication structural clarity. Now, this is not just limited to lectures, although it can be, but I'm even talking about assignment descriptions here. I'm even talking about how you set expectations for your courses. Do they understand and see the house as it's built? Do they see the framework? right? Are you giving them different opportunities to see these different structural realities so that they can understand that there is a point and a purpose to how you've designed your course, your content, your learning objectives? Here's the reality. What I'm trying to say here is that there should be some structural clarity with you in terms of thinking about the big picture. And I think that there's a level here where a lot of where we get into trouble with communication is that we assume understanding. We assume understanding, and we can't necessarily do that. So it might make sense in your mind. Does it make sense in your student's mind? And I'll tell you, and I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but a lot of what I think about with clarity in my classes, I ask myself the question every semester before I teach a class, or before I teach any class, even like a 6-week accelerated course in the summer. Where is it possible that my students will be so confused that they will have to send me an email? Because if I can limit the amount of clarifying emails coming in, just saves me time. And honestly, like, my colleagues look at me like I'm crazy. I can teach a course with 200-300 students, one course, and I might be limited to 4 to 5 different emails over the course of the semester because I'm anticipating questions that they may have. Saves me a ton of time. I love it. So Susan just said, does that make sense? I think we need to ask that in terms of the content that we're presenting. I think we also need to ask that in terms of the course that we're presenting. Does it make sense? Does the assignment description make sense? And a lot of times, adding more does not increase structural clarity. In fact, it's the opposite. Sometimes subtracting increases structural clarity. Okay. Now, let me give you some quick tips here. So as we consider this, as we want to consider increasing our clarity, what do we want to do? We want to increase immediacy. We're going to talk about that a little bit when we talk about rapport and relevancy. We want to consider the prior knowledge of our students, organize carefully according to the student, not necessarily according to us. Develop these explanations and examples, preview and review, and then also clarify visually when we can. I'm not saying that everything in your courses has to be represented by some, visual correspondence, right? But it helps. And I think it can really solidify some different things for your students. But as an instructor, your life is lived in terms of messages. It really is. But the reality is that as an instructor, we have so many different messages that we're trying to send on a regular basis: informative, persuasive, affective, ritualistic, imaginative. Y'all, we are sending messages constantly. The problem, and this is where I think it is different than 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Your students are bombarded now with messages not coming from you all the time. So you have to be able to cut through the clutter. Now, again, I mentioned that you're going to have access to these slides. I'm going to give you, there's probably 5 slides in a row where we do not have time to go through every single bullet point. I want to encourage you to go back and kind of look at some different things, but I want to go through all 5 of these different types of messages that you send and give you at least one quick tip to think about as you think about clarity. So let's start with informative first. I think this is really important. So we want to demonstrate competence in terms of sending and receiving messages that give or obtain information. This is key. So what does that mean? One quick tip: structure our information using previews, questions, transitions, summaries. Structural clarity, right? Structural clarity. Now, let's keep going. Again, if you want to go and look at all of these other ones, you can. I just want to make sure that we're careful of time. Affective messages. We want to demonstrate competence in sending and receive messages that express or respond to feelings. Ultimately, this means that we want to be emotionally intelligent about ourselves, about our students, and I would also say emotionally intelligent about the content as a whole. So one thing we can do: reveal both positive and negative feelings about ourselves to students. We've got to be careful with this because I tend to be of the kind of camp that says I want to be careful with the type of disclosure that I am providing to my students. I don't want to disclose too much, but I want to disclose enough to where they know that I'm human, that I'm not a robot, and that I'm still an emotional being too, right? But I do think that this is one thing that we can kind of think about. Imaginative messages. We want to demonstrate competence in sending and receiving messages that speculate, theorize, or fantasize. This is beautiful. Now, think about this from what part of you were saying earlier about student-centered vocabulary. Even if we're using student-centered vocabulary, we can still be vivid and descriptive in our language. That's good. We want that, right? Doesn't mean that we're using jargon, doesn't mean that we're using 25-cent words when a 5-cent words were due, but descriptive language is good. It's okay. Vivid language is good. There's a reason why every PR firm in the world right now talks about storytelling. Well, part of what good stories do is they use vivid language. It is good to focus on that. Ritualistic messages. Teachers should demonstrate competence in sending and receiving messages that maintain social relationships and facilitate interaction. So what does that mean? We want to, and this, I know this probably seems like too baseline, but my guess is of our 237 participants in this room right now, we probably have some that maybe struggle with this a little bit. We want to demonstrate appropriate behavior related to everyday behaviors, greeting, taking turns in conversation, literally like being in relationship with these students. This is part of what we need to think about. And then finally, persuasive messages. Demonstrate competence in sending and receiving messages that seek to convince. Part of what we need to do here, quick tip, differentiate between facts and opinions. The purpose of our course, in part, is to create students that are literate in whatever that topic area is, right? We want to increase our students' literacy. Part of how we do that is differentiating these. So again, I would encourage you to go back into these slides, look through those additional bullets, but I at least wanted to kind of give you a little bit of context for, well, how do we achieve this? Because we send messages all the time, right? All right, so let's keep going. The reality is, in many ways, even in your asynchronous online courses, teaching is public speaking. It really is. How are you organizing the content? What is the content? And then how are you delivering the content? How are you organizing the course? How are you presenting the course and delivering the course? The reality is, teaching in many ways is public speaking. We have to start thinking about it like that again. Now, in the chat, I would encourage you to think about, hey, how are some other ways that you can increase clarity? I would encourage you to maybe talk about that. I think we've already got some discussions going on, but if you want to insert some of those, how can you increase clarity? And then I'm going to go really quickly into rapport and engagement. So clarity, in my opinion, is crucial. It's really important. Like, we want to make sure our courses are clear. And to be honest with you, if our courses are clear, that solves a lot of these different issues. We also want to make sure, though, that we are building rapport with our students. So here's part of how we build rapport, relationships with our students. In part, we know our students. Now, I get it. I go to one of the largest universities in the United States, or I teach at one of the largest universities in the United States of America, upwards of 70,000 students. I have a course that starts on Monday that has 283 students right now signed up. Can I know every single student on a deep personal level? I cannot. I do not have the relational capital or relational capacity to do that. Can I know them broadly as a group? I do believe that I can. And can I know a couple on a more personal basis? I do think so. But ultimately, we want to know our students. I think part of how we build rapport is we set expectations, both for how students engage with the course, how students engage with the instructor. And I would also argue that we need to set expectations in terms of how students communicate with each other. That is key right now. Now, we aren't going to go too deeply into the woods with this, but part of how we increase rapport is by asking good questions. I don't know if you knew this. There are so many different types of questions. It's almost embarrassing. Like, it just, there are a lot. But asking good questions can bring our students out and establish a relationship with them and build rapport with them. So as you think about, your courses, think about how you are structuring the questions that you ask your students to get to know them and to get to know the different layers or levels of their connection to the content, right? So I give you a couple different ways to think about good questions, but honestly, as you think about regular everyday conversation, you don't want to be the person in a conversation that's never asking anyone a question and is always just sharing information about yourself. The other side is you don't want to be the person who's always asking questions and never disclosing. So there's a balance, but our courses need to resonate with good questions if we want to get to know our students. Part of how we need to think about building rapport too, because power dynamics still exist, we are still in many ways the authorities in our students. We set the expectation, we set the tone, we set whether or not that is a positive or a negative classroom climate. So we need to make sure that we are managing the classroom well, right? Now, I think this is a really important slide, and I wish we had a little bit more time to go through all of these, but I wanted to give you a little bit of, hey, when I talk about managing the classroom well as it comes to climate that I can encourage based on communication, what does that mean? Well, I want to have a supportive climate rather than a defensive climate. So what that means is instead of a climate that emphasizes passing judgment, I want to try to create an environment that sets up genuine requests for information, right? So that's just one particular example, but the reality is that we can establish supportive communication climates in our classes. That's part of how we build rapport. So ultimately, final thought here, to truly build relationships, know yourself. How are you wired? Who are you? What's your personality? And then ultimately know your students as best you can. All right. So in the chat again, that one went pretty quickly. I want you to kind of give a few ideas about how you can increase rapport, how you can build relationships with your students. And then while those are coming in, I want to quickly go to engagement and talk about a couple different things. Now, my guess is a lot of the sessions that you're going to go to today probably will resonate with engagement in some capacity. Unfortunately, a lot of what we think about when we think about engagement right now is ed tech related. So when I meet with faculty members and we do a coaching session, I'll say, hey, how are you promoting engagement in your courses? They'll say, well, I use Kahoot. And I'll go, awesome. How are you promoting engagement in your courses? How are you encouraging students to be present in your class? It's not just the tools that you use, it's the environment that you set up. Part of how we create engagement is by using varied instructional strategies. That means that we're thinking about students, thinking about styles, learning preferences, but we're doing different things, right? So here's the deal. Two kind of key themes of questions I need to think about as you think about how are you encouraging your students to be present in the class from a communication perspective. You as the faculty member need to step back and say, what do you need? What do you want? But ultimately, in many ways, those questions are trumped by the other two questions. What do your students need and what do they want? And how are you fostering a climate that resonates with communication that encourages engagement around those student-centered questions, right? Now, really quickly, I want to give you a couple different things to think about. And then if we have some questions, I want to make sure to leave at least a couple minutes for that. My guess is you probably have high anxiety students. You might be a high anxiety instructor, right? If you have high anxiety students, here are a couple different things that you can do. Avoid grading on participation. That's not necessarily helpful. Avoid randomly calling on students to respond. Praise students when they participate. That's good. Like reward them verbally or in writing when they communicate. Avoid indicating if an answer is completely wrong. Now we have to be careful with this because we don't want to foster misinformation. Like if an answer is wrong, we need to articulate that. But try to find some silver lining within to go, you know what, you said this. I want to go a little bit of a different direction in terms of additional answers, but I want to come back to what you just mentioned about X because I want to talk about that. Be consistent in how you handle student talk. What I mean by that is how do you, we want to make sure that you're not demonstrating favoritism, and then be clear about expectations for participation, and then give students options for how they participate in your class. Just because a student is not, raising their hand or always verbally responding to, oh my goodness, making you seasick, always verbally responding to a question that you ask does not mean they're not present. They might be high anxiety, and that's not necessarily how they prefer to communicate with you. All right. Now, if you've ever read Teaching at Its Best, I would encourage you to do so. But it's funny, if you look at the ways to increase student motivation, there are 55 different strategies that are listed to increase student motivation. I went through and looked, like I counted. 24 of the 55, I would argue, are directly related to communication. Now, I could make an argument that probably another 15 of those are somewhat connected to communication, but I'm talking directly, like there are communication elements embedded, right? And I think that's pretty interesting. That's telling to me that part of how we increase student motivation is by communication. So I give you a list there in terms of some different things that I think are really important in terms of how we can think about student motivation and effective communication. But I want to leave you with this, right? As we think about how we communicate in our classes, perfect is the enemy of good. It is. So I think there's a level here where as you're thinking about your courses, you don't have to be perfect in terms of how you communicate, but hopefully I've given you some different things to think about in terms of communication in your classrooms that hopefully will set up some different things, some different realities later for you that maybe are just some ways that we can always be kind of rounding out those rough edges. Two different resources for you, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and then I will answer any questions that we have. Communication for teachers and then communication for the classroom teacher are both wonderful resources. Unfortunately, both are a little dated in terms of copyright date, but the information's still good and the information is still relevant. But I wanted to at least kind of position those as two potential options for you if you wanted to do a little bit more of a deeper dive. The chat has been awesome. Y'all have been great. We've got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to stop sharing. If we do have any questions, would love to answer any of those that we have. Let me go ahead and go to, let's see, the Q&A. Do you have communication strategies aimed specifically at students who are clearly not interested in the class that they have to take? Okay, this is awesome. Oliver, this is a great question. And I would actually love to see if anyone else has some additional responses in this. So if I have students who, like I call those are checkbox classes. Starting Monday, I am teaching it's called COM 1000 at our course or at our university. I'm going to have 300 students. It is a checkbox course, probably for 98% of those students. I always, in my courses, start with relevance reflections. So even in an asynchronous online course, which is what my course next week will be, I give them an assignment at the beginning of the course that says, hey, look, I want you to write down 3 different things that you want to get out of this particular course. And then as we go throughout this class, I want you to remember these 3 different things. I'm going to remind you to remember your why. Remember your why. And I think that's part of it. Like that's more psychological. You want to just always be bringing them back to why they're there in the first place. But I think that's really important because most of our students, to be honest with you, are probably taking classes that they don't necessarily love, right? Or that they're kind of sitting there going, I just got to be done with this. So I think that's one thing that you can do is force them to articulate kind of relevance and kind of think about some different things in that regard in terms of encouraging agency and ownership. Yeah, so I've got I have no TAs for my class next week, by the way. So hopefully I'm in your thoughts and prayers. All right. There's a second question. It's a little bit long, so I want to just make sure that I'm looking at it appropriately. All right, Gene, I'm gonna skip yours for now. Carlos, how do you deal with cell phone addicted students? I don't know if you all saw this. I think in California, Governor Newsom just I don't know where it is. I literally just saw a headline, but I think they're trying to push legislation through banning smartphones in K-12 environments at least. So we did a faculty interview once where, as part of the person's teaching demo, he told his students, hey, I want your cell phone out. If you're on your cell phone and you're not paying attention to me, that's my fault. And I thought that was a really bold strategy. And by the time he was done, probably 50% of the students had put their phone down, but 50% of the students did not. So I thought that was interesting. I don't mind giving my students opportunities to use their phone. So like, I don't mind giving them opportunities to Google something or look something up. I think that's the reality in which we live. Like, it's not necessarily an extension of them, but I think that it's good for them to not feel like they have to just completely put it away. So I think it's more of thinking about the class in terms of its interaction to say, are there ways that I can incorporate their devices as opposed to just forcing them to set them aside? And really trying to think about also, are you breaking up the content in such a way so that they don't have time to just sit there and scroll. So what I mean by that is like if you're lecturing for 50 minutes, they're gonna have time to sit there and scroll, right? Cell phone breaks are also awesome. Like when I'm in a meeting, I'm checking email, I'm doing other things. So we just have to be careful with that. Y'all were great. It's 45 minutes in, so I just want to be really careful of time, but I just want to thank you. This is a really engaged group. Again, connect with me, look at those slides, and if you have any other questions for me after today, by all means, get in touch.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael, for this fantastic presentation. Again, the recording will be available next week. We also have the slides in here. I hope you got a lot. The chat was amazing. I recommend you kind of go back and look through those ideas as well. There's been some amazing ideas. We do have 2 more sets of sessions coming up. We will be digging a bit more in communication. So folks, go back to the Summit homepage and click on agenda, and you'll be able to choose your next session. Michael, thank you so much for a fantastic session today. Bye-bye, everyone.